Welcome back. In the last entry, we discussed the origins of vampirism as told through the perspective of Cain and Lilith, which was communicated to us via the Book of Nod and the revelations of the Dark Mother. In keeping with the theme of origin stories, the next several entries of my Iceberg series are fully devoted to unpacking the origin stories of each of the 13 clans that continue to exist up to this very night. Approaching each clan this way has several benefits in that we'll learn of some cool vampire lore that'll add much needed context to later Iceberg entries, as well as knock out several other entries on the Iceberg at once. And who knows, maybe we'll find some new Iceberg entries along the way. Anyway, let's talk about some vampires, specifically the vampires of Clan Gangrel. The kindred of Clan Gangrel are primal, direct, purposeful, and seemingly untamable. You can see the raw instinct that drives them simply by looking into their eyes, even during times of calm. To the Camarilla and Sabbat, the Gangrel are dogs that are loyal to a fault, serving as both valuable asset and unpredictable liability. The bulk of Clan Gangrel served under the Camarilla for a majority of its existence, though as of tonight, the Gangrel have withdrawn from the Camarilla to remain as an independent clan for reasons seemingly unknown, though widely speculated. To the average vampire, the Gangrel are drifters and vagabonds with a historical reputation of consorting with the Romani, as well as walking with and even befriending lupines, primarily werewolves. They're also known for harboring a long-standing, very mutual hatred for members of Clan Ravnos, a hatred and feud that continues to persist up to this very night. Mortals embraced into the clan develop a strange affinity for nature and independence, meaning they often dwell among the wilds or in the most remote parts of a given city, really anywhere in which they can keep to themselves. The Gangrel's disciplines of animalism, fortitude, and protean allows them to befriend animals and to shape their physical form to better suit their tasks and environment. Their unique clan bane causes them to manifest terrible animalistic features during and after a frenzy, as if their inner beast is quite literally ripping its way out from within. These physical mutations are often temporary, only lasting about as long as the average hangover, though some of these changes to their form may remain indefinitely. Indeed, many nightly sightings of cryptids and beasts of folklore like werewolves, skinwalkers, chupacabras, wendigos, ghouls, hell even the many Bigfoots of the world, may have actually been encounters with members of Clan Gangrel. A little side note, by the way, as of tonight, some reports tell of Gangrel who possess a different type of clan bane, one that causes them to prioritize flight over fight due to their beast's obsession with survival and self-preservation. There are few vampires whose history is as misunderstood as the solitary vampires of Clan Gangrel, and while other clans actively work to enshroud their history with contradictory statements and half-truths, the history of the Gangrel is unknown primarily due to them simply not giving a damn. The Ferals rarely interact with others, let alone members of their own clan. They rarely share their history with others, and even if they do, those lucky enough to hear it rarely get the chance to write it down. Luckily for us, we have Lord Ashton. One of the source books I'll be using to discuss the Ferals, Clan Book Gangrel 1st edition, is a source book that presents itself as a compilation of documents attempting to outline the history of, well, the titular clan, which is told to us by one Lord Ashton. Clan Book Gangrel Revised Edition, which came out during VTM Revised Edition's Reign of Terror, aka VTM 3rd Edition, presents itself as a sort of proofread and analysis of Lord Ashton's historical proposal. Very little is known about the Gangrel Lord Ashton himself, but it's important that we understand his highly scrutinized interpretation of his clan's origins, which more or less serves as a good baseline for the clan's entire history. I've broken down the Gangrel's history into different chapters, with each chapter covering one or more historical eras. I did my best to keep it all as chronological as possible, and I'll also read aloud the title of each chapter for those who tend to listen more than watch these videos. Anyways, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Child of Wolves, Prehistoric Times. The following events are said to have taken place after Lilith was cast out of the heavens by God and exiled to the land of Nod, pregnant with either the child of Adam or God. I covered all of these events in my Cain and Lilith video, so if nothing I just said made any sense to you, you know what to do. Lilith was alone and among the wilderness when she gave birth to the child of God or Adam, the first natural birth that had ever occurred up to this point according to this Nodist-adjacent lore. Only a small host of creatures and animals were present during Lilith's birth. These beasts had yet to be named as predator or prey by Adam, and so they watched the birth peacefully. Each creature present would be remembered as a wolf, bear, tiger, serpent, and a still unnamed and unknown creature called the Beast. And each of these 5 animals would take in and care for each of the 5 of Lilith's children. Some claim that the serpent's child was stillborn, and that the rest of the children would go on to become the progenitor to all lupines and lycanthropes that exist tonight. Or in other words, 4 out of the 5 of Lilith's children would serve as the true descendants of all werebeasts, according to Lord Ashton, though very few actually believe this to be the case. Regardless, of the 5 children that were born from Lilith, one would stand out from among the rest: the child raised by wolves, known as Anoia. Anoia would eventually grow up and even mate with other members of her pack, her children bearing features of both man and wolf. After a time, the immortal Anoia would leave her pack and explore the world, where she would eventually come across the first city of mankind, known as Enoch. Her beauty and affinity for nature was well received by the rulers and inhabitants of the city, and she even exhibited traits similar to those vampires who ruled over it. Anoia, like the undead, was immortal. She was a child of Lilith, after all, whose blood possesses the power of creation itself. It was this very same blood that Lilith used to transform Cain, after all. Though, it's important to keep in mind, Anoia is not yet a vampire. Anoia would reside within the city of Enoch for a time, though according to Lord Ashton, her beauty and lack of social morality basically meant she loved and fucked pretty much anyone who asked nicely. This promiscuity caused her to become a rather problematic woman to those within Enoch, thus prompting Anoia to leave the city to wander the world once again. According to our boy Lord Ashton, Anoia would birth several children from her illegitimate lovers within Enoch, and these children would eventually go on to form the Roma, though this point is quickly proven false by the analysis performed within the revised clan book, and pretty much anybody who puts more than 5 seconds of thought into such a crazy-ass assumption. That would be like if you were reading the Bible, and it suddenly said Noah and his descendants would survive the Great Flood, and his children would go on to form the Mexicans. Anoia would repeat this cycle of wandering, settling, and then watching as her presence caused discord time and time again. Eventually, one of the children of Cain from the first city found and convinced Anoia to return to Enoch. Then Anoia would be embraced by an unknown member of the 2nd generation and become the 3rd generation antediluvian, or founder, of Clan Gangrel. The end. That is essentially Lord Ashton and most of VTM First Edition's purported take on the origins of Clan Gangrel. It doesn't explain a lot. I mean, it doesn't really explain the general disdain that Gangrel and Ravnos have for one another, or how the Gangrel have occasionally found peace between themselves and werewolves. Look, there's a lot that it doesn't cover, but going forward, our analysis of the Ferals will be done via the Clan Book Revised Edition, which builds off of everything we just discussed. So, with all that being said, let's continue. Chapter 2, The Tiger and Spider, Prehistoric Times. Anoia would remain in the first city until its eventual destruction, which most Nahdists claim was via the Great Deluge or Flood that washed the earth free of sin. At some point either before or after the fall of the first city, the history of Anoia begins to become regularly associated with a different male figure called Ravana, whom some claim is the true identity of the mysterious thing known as the Ravnos Antediluvian. The relationship between Anoia and Ravana is unknown, though most sources refer to them as brother and sister. Them being referred to as siblings this way is probably done with a vampiric, dare I say, consanguineous context, though it's unclear if they were lovers, friends, bound via blood bond, etc. The immediate history of Anoia after the fall of the first city is more or less unknown, though the general Nahdist interpretation goes something like this. After the fall of the first city by way of the flood, Cain leaves his 2nd and 3rd generation offspring like Anoia and Ravana to fend for themselves, to which his offspring would leave Cain, find the children of Noah, and establish rule over them. Then the 2nd generation would each create a series of 3rd generation broods to honor Cain, remembered as the Antediluvians. Anoia, of course, being the antediluvian of what would eventually become Clan Gangrel. Then the first antediluvian uprising occurs, in which the 3rd generation would rise and devour, destroy, or otherwise drive away all of the 2nd generation in its entirety. Again, all of this is covered in my Cain and Lilith video. Okay, so with all that context in place, we can continue discussing what we know of Anoia and Ravana's story. After the 2nd generation was destroyed, it is believed Anoia and Ravana migrated westward towards the vast steppes of Central Asia, which seems to be one of the oldest historical origin points for Anoia's history. The 2 siblings found several nomadic tribes of primeval man, to which Anoia and Ravana would find their sustenance and companionship. Anoia, the child of wolves, was liberated from the constraints of the walled city and free to run among a pack, just as she was raised. Legends claim that Anoia would only embrace those she deemed worthy, wolves like her who could survive among the harsh wildlands. How would she go about testing this worthiness? It was simple. Turn those people that she deemed worthy into vampires and then abandon them in the wilderness. Sure, Anoia would occasionally watch and judge from afar, but unless this neonate uncovers and maintains their newfound thirst for blood and weakness to sunlight, Anoia would simply leave them to the wolves. Only after one has survived for a prolonged period would Anoia and her kind appear before the neonate and tell the truth of their newfound vampiric state. Those 4th and 5th generation vampires that survived these ordeals would be known as the Gangrel Methuselah. This tradition of embracing someone and then abandoning them in the wilderness is still regularly practiced up to this very night, the victim often never meeting their sire until years after their embrace, if ever. Ravana would also go on to embrace mortals into what some believe to be the Methuselah of Clan Ravnos. Then, something happened between Anoia and Ravana. Either the two had a falling out, or one rejected the other's advances, or simply they started fighting over resources. Regardless, according to legend, Anoia and Ravana would be driven to conflict that lasted for centuries. The two would fling each other's vampiric packs at each other like soldiers, allegedly performing mass embraces just to bring the other down. Most agree that while Anoia and her brood dominated in strength, Ravana and his Ravnos were masters at cunning and deception. All of this fighting would ultimately culminate into Ravana calling down some storm of unholy devastation from the skies above, thus destroying, disabling, or otherwise driving away all of Anoia and her kind. Some Gangrel claim that this devastation brought upon them was so chaotic that it caused all the surviving ferals of Anoia's pack to fight amongst each other, thus causing them to split into their own independent broods. The broods that traveled north would eventually find themselves among the cold Siberian and Scandinavian wildlands. The brood that traveled south would go on to populate the African plains above the Sahara. The brood that attempt to flee back the brood that attempt to travel back east was utterly destroyed, for that was where the Ravnos and their Cathayan demons came from. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Essentially, it's fair to assume that the Ravnos came from the east. The rest would flee westward towards Europe, where a vast majority of the clan's lineage could be traced as of tonight. Anoia and her whereabouts after this chaotic jihad with Ravana is almost entirely unknown, though most agree that she would regularly slip in and out of torpor until around the time of Christ, to which most believe she has remained asleep ever since. Anoia's offspring, the Gangrel Methuselah, would continue to drift across the world and, do historical vampire stuff throughout the ages. Before we start breaking down the Gangrel's influence on history, though, let's cover some of the many interpretations that attempt to explain the feud between the Gangrel and the Ravnos. One of the strangest interpretations regarding the feud between Anoia and Ravana presents itself in the form of an inscription discovered deep within an empty, tomb-like cave on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Scholars estimated that the cave had been empty for nearly 300 years by the time of the 2000s, and the inscription itself seemed to be pre-Alexandrian in nature. After research was performed and translations were made, the following could be read. The great spider king gave me his silk when I was a boy. Pause. As a man, I tired of its taste and spat myself from his court. Pause. The spider hunted the tiger queen and her pride. As the tiger queen had done me no wrong, I put an arrow in the spider's eye, spilling his fluid anew. His hunters struck me as they did the pride. The hunters were the sky and fire and the stone and the flood. We were only stooped and bloodied men. As we fled, the great Spider King used fire against my name and destroyed it. The Tiger Queen carved a new name across my chest. She gave me her seed, pause, I think, and for a third time I was born. Have I a court now? When I escape this cave, perhaps I shall learn. Yeah, so that was weird. I've read this inscription like 12 times, and here's my interpretation. The Spider King is Ravnos and the Tiger Queen is Anoia. This unnamed individual was fed the blood of the Spider King as a boy, thus making him a ghoul. As a man, he was somehow able to break free from the blood bond. The Tiger Queen Anoia attacks the Spider King, and the man decides to betray and perhaps even blind the Spider King. The Spider King that gets mad as hell for this calls upon some gnarly devastation, and that results in the death of the unnamed man. Luckily for him, Anoia embraced him and apparently left him sealed in this cave, or otherwise he was trapped here. Regardless, let's hope this fella escaped. Another strange interpretation attempting to explain the jihad between the Gangrel and Ravnos goes something like this. Thousands of years ago, there existed a godlike figure, probably Cain, who had many children. Naturally, these children fought a lot. Anoya and Churka, the youngest of the siblings and a pair of twins, chose to leave their aggressive brothers and sisters and travel east towards the land of their mother. Unable to escape their combative nature and without a father to control them, the twins regularly came to blows. Both were evenly and perfectly matched, meaning neither could face each other directly with a definitive victor. So the twins began to recruit armies. Anoya amassed an army of the bravest warriors, and Churka amassed the most cunning. The two battled at night in order to hide their feud from the attention of the gods. Both armies fought for centuries until eventually, when it was believed that Anoya's army would finally claim victory, she was betrayed by her two best warriors, Liban and Lianin. Without two of her generals, the battle ultimately tilted in the favor of Churka's army. We'll learn more of the Lianin later on in this video, but the Liban will be saved for a future video. Saddened by this betrayal, Anoya left her children and disappeared. Without the support of their progenitor, Anoya's kind would be defeated and driven out of their eastern lands by Churka and the Cathayan demons that supported them. From that night on, the survivors of Anoya's forces called themselves the Gangrel, and they traveled towards the west, eventually encountering other vampiric cousins. Even tonight, some Gangrel claim that when Churka and his army are destroyed and the betrayers driven away and punished, Anoya would return to her children. The final, much more grounded theory attempting to explain the feud between the Gangrel and Ravnos goes something like this. At some point in the early medieval period, when the Roma left India and pushed towards Europe, some of them had Ravnos traveling alongside them. As these Roma traveled from kingdom to kingdom, they had to gain writs of passage from local authorities. Sometimes they couldn't get these writs, and sometimes the writs weren't of much use as the Roma were, by all accounts, generally mistrusted by everyone. Luckily for those Roma who had Ravnos traveling alongside them, vampires had a much easier time gaining access to territories typically banned from Roma presence. Things were made even more difficult as the Roma pushed towards Central Europe, where any given Ravnos was no more likely than his Roma caravan to speak the language. When Roma happened upon European Gangrel, some offered their own blood to the Shilmulo in return for the favor of acquiring letters of safe passage. Shilmulo is simply the Roma phrase meaning cold dead that was typically used by their people to describe vampires. This scheme worked out well for both sides, and a few Gangrel actually acquired Roma herds of their own, until eventually fights began to break out between the two clans when inevitably some Gangrel or Ravnos would claim dominion over certain bands of Roma that the other clan claimed belonged to them. And then you kind of get it from there. Then the fights start going off and, now we're here. Now we all hate each other. Regardless, this is just one of several theories that ultimately fails to give a concrete reason as to why the feud between the Gangrel and Ravnos is maintained. Keep in mind that the Gangrel primarily share their tales and stories orally, meaning they hardly ever write stuff down. So honestly, any of these interpretations could be true, or none of them. Chances are, though, the answer lies somewhere in between all of them. Honestly, I could end the story of the Gangrel there, but I do think there's some historical events that are definitely worth mentioning, so let's talk about them, starting with the very beginning of early civilization, or at least what we know. We're talking like 3500 BC and beyond. Some historical fragments suggest the presence of Gangrel, who would skulk about the outer walls of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations for thousands of years, from Sumer to Babylon. Others speak of the Gangrel who would participate in the development of Greek civilization as far back as their wars with the Scythians. So far, I think I've done a good job at establishing the general idea of a Gangrel kindred. These rugged, individualistic, and animalistic loner types that are sometimes mistaken as werewolves who rarely come together under a common cause beyond survival instinct. Despite this, there are exceptions to this vagabond way of existence, rare as they are. Which brings us nicely to Chapter 3, Destruens Invictum, late Roman period, roughly 280 to roughly 640 AD. One legend states that a Gallic Gangrel embraced two worshippers of the Syrian sun god named Sol Invictus. Early vampire hunters captured the first of these two sun worshippers and basically forced her to hold council with their sun god, and she died instantly. The other worshipper, the neonate remembered as Constanus, survived this traumatic ordeal, though the events he suffered served as a sort of divine reckoning to himself and his views on all vampire kind. Constantinus took it upon himself to hunt down and destroy any mortals who forfeited the lives of Cainites. Constantinus claimed that this was even mandated in the Book of Nod itself, wherein Yahweh states that no mortal shall be permitted to raise a hand against the children of Cain. Since all vampires wear this mark, any mortal who raised a hand against the kindred were to be hunted and put down by Constantinus's brood. This brood would be remembered as the Invicti. The Invicti would grow to legendary status for a time. They would earn many favors and debts to other kindred, as well as the hatred and wrath of the vampire hunters the Invicti regularly fought. Indeed, the Invicti would go on to serve as the premier faction for Clan Gangrel, holding a great deal of political power within the vampiric underworld for several hundred years. However, at around 600 AD or so, like early medieval Dark Ages, a majority of the Invicti would meet their final death at the hands of a great fire that occurred in northern Italy. The cause of this fire is entirely unknown, though it's easy to speculate that the vampire hunters simply came out on top. By 650 AD, the term Invicti was almost entirely forgotten. So, to summarize, for a brief period of time, a bunch of Gangrel pagans actually came together to start a sort of zealous witch hunt against witch hunters, until their eventual destruction. Just the idea of Gangrel working together in such a capacity is rare as hell, but the Invicti themselves are so unknown that they aren't even on my iceberg yet, though they have certainly earned a spot among the lower tiers. I'd love to see how the Invicti fared against my boy Caiaphas Smith. Anyway, let's move on to Chapter 4, The Egyptian, Early Middle Ages, roughly 100 to 476 AD. Another standout figure and newfound iceberg entry within Gangrel history presents itself in the form of Marcus Sextus. If that name sounds familiar to you, there's a very interesting reason as to why, but we'll talk about that in a moment. At some point in time, an Egyptian was born in Latinized Cairo within the century following Christ's death. This Egyptian made his way to Rome after being embraced by a Gangrel Methuselah. Upon entering Rome, the man presented himself before the Malkavian and Ventru lords of the city, referring to himself simply as the Egyptian. The rulers of the city welcomed the Egyptian and gave him a new Roman name, Marcus Sextus. The Egyptian Marcus Sextus had lived as a nobleman, and he constantly sought the approval and companionship of the city's undead leaders. However, the greedy patrons of the Senate used the Gangrel's desires to pull him this way and that, and by the conclusion of the Roman Empire, Sextus was nothing more than a mere pawn. Several hundred years would pass as Sextus served the Senate, until a Gangrel thing was called in the year 475 AD. If you recall, a Gangrel thing, or gather, or great gather, is a rarely held, clan-exclusive gathering of any and all Gangrel within the entire local region, regardless of creed or affiliation. During this gathering, Sextus had his first and final encounter with the Gangrel legend once known as Arnulf. Who's Arnulf? Well, I'll put it this way. It was said that, in life, Arnulf fought and survived a duel versus Alexander the Great. In his vampiric afterlife, it is known that he met his legendary end at the hands of fucking Dracula himself. Unfortunately for Marcus Sextus, this Gangrel gigachad that was staring at him was not on the side of the Romans like Sextus himself. In fact, Arnulf was part of the Huns or the barbarians or whoever that were actively in the process of staging an invasion of the already declining Rome. How did that wind up? Well, I'll put it this way. 1 year after this thing occurred, in 476 AD specifically, the Roman era ends and the Dark Ages begins. So, anyway, after this gathering ends, the Egyptian naturally returns to the city, spends a couple months in contemplation, and then Sextus ultimately chooses to abandon Rome and flee across the Mediterranean into Africa. There he embraced numerous tribespeople before meeting his end at the hands of his final child, Inyanga, who now roams the northern United States. Some Gangrel see this as reason to believe that Inyanga, among others, serves as a common ancestor to most North American Gangrel. So, when I first heard the name Marcus Sextus, my immediate thoughts were, either this is a name from someone in Warhammer, or this is a real-life Roman figure who was translated into Vampire the Masquerade lore. Or I guess Vampire the Dark Ages, it doesn't matter. What I did not expect to find is a real-life painting from like 1799 or something, done by a French artist named whatever that says, called The Return of Marcus Sextus. The painting hauntingly depicts the fictitious Roman Marcus Sextus, who returns home from the terrors of the proscriptions of Sulla, only to find his daughters in tears at the bedside of his dead wife. He sits beside his family with a cold, penetrating stare, as if fully aware that the death of his wife was at the hands of an empire already doomed to fall. Don't be mistaken, while Marcus Sextus is an entirely fictitious character made to encapsulate an era of terror and decline, the proscriptions of Sulla were really real and really terrifying. Definitely give it a Google sometime. When looking at this painting from a Vampire the Masquerade perspective, I'm pretty sure this is art depicting the Egyptian Marcus Sextus absolutely shitting himself at the terrifying thought of Arnulf on his way to drive his Germanian tribal fist through Marcus's face, thus signaling the end of the Roman era. Let it be known that if my opponent was a giant Eastern European vampire, I too would flee to Africa. Chapter 5. The Stone Beasts of Burden. High Middle Ages, roughly 1100 AD. Of course, we can't discuss the history of the Gangrel without acknowledging the unique bloodline that appeared during the Dark Ages known as the Gargoyles. But before we discuss the Gargoyles, we must first give an extremely brief background on a different vampire clan, Clan Tremere. So here's an extremely watered-down summary. At some point during the Dark Ages, like 600-ish years after Marcus Sextus, a group of human medieval mages and occultists incidentally discovered a way to ritualistically turn themselves into vampires during their attempts to unlock the secrets of immortality. So now we have hooded vampire wizards who know occult, black and blood magic, who are widely despised and seen as illegitimate by most other vampire clans we've established up to this point. Enemies of the Tremere at this time refused to even acknowledge the young clan as true vampires. Matter of fact, Clan Tremere wasn't even a mention during my breakdown of the 13 Antediluvians in the Cain and Lilith video, nor were they even an option in the poll I made leading up to this video. So, the Tremere experimented with vampiric blood and found out how to ritualistically unlock vampirism with it. As you can probably guess, this experimentation with VIII didn't stop there. One could go on for literal hours describing the various blood rituals uncovered by the Tremere, from being able to climb on walls to turning beings both living and dead into inanimate objects. Rituals that allow the Tremere to consume blood from afar, or to dehydrate the blood of other vampires, causing them to become whites or to fall into torpor. Very metal and very terrifying. So, how did the Tremere get a hold of all of this vampire blood to experiment with beyond their own? Well, the Ventru are too busy surrounding themselves with kings and castles, so they wouldn't make good targets for blood ritual experimentation. The Bruja are far too violent and difficult to wrangle, and they travel in packs, so they wouldn't make a good target either. Well, it turns out that the disfigured freaks of Clan Nosferatu, who constantly remained hidden from the world, would be great targets. And of course, so would the Gangrel. The wolves that walk alone dies alone. The creepy alien bastards of Clan Shemitzi would also make a good target as well, simply because their blood possessed the ability to shape and change the physical flesh it's encapsulated in, a very effective property when used in the context of blood alchemy. If a Gangrel is abducted by a Tremere in the forest and no one is around to see it, does it constitute a war crime? Yes. What did the Tremere do with their collection of Nosferatu, Gangrel, and Shemitzi? Well, they got to work. The process is simple enough. Take a Gangrel, sew it onto a Nosferatu, then Frankenstein a bunch of organic components like wings, horns, claws, teeth, whatever seems suitable, wrap up the grafted creation in a sack made of a cow or horse womb, pour in some Shemitzi blood and the alchemical equivalent of fetal waters, and then let the mixture gestate for up to several weeks. Regularly bless and enchant the fetal sac on a weekly basis, or the mixture would be aborted quicker than a fetus in San Francisco. Put in some of your own blood so that you can establish a blood bond with the creation. When ready, the newborn amalgamation will burst from the sac, to which purifying smokes would be necessary to preserve the newborn. The result of this creation leaves the newborn disfigured and hardened like stone thanks to the blood of the Nosferatu. The newborn was almost entirely stripped of their humanity, imbued with a fierce primality thanks to the blood of the Gangrel. The newborn's bodies and its features would all be organically fused into one more or less stable being thanks to the blood of the Shemitzi. The result? A loyal and mostly mindless slave known as a gargoyle. This brings us to the late Middle Ages or so, roughly 1450 AD. The Tremere kidnapped and tortured dozens of vampires in order to permanently transform them into gargoyles. There were even different classes of gargoyle, with some serving as the iconic stone sentinel and watcher sat upon the tower, while others served as warriors or measly servants. In time, the gargoyles would begin to develop their own entirely unique disciplines that helped fully set them apart as a new bloodline, or perhaps even clan. The most common discipline developed by the gargoyles is known as Viscerotica, which essentially operates like a much more defensive form of Protean. Viscerotica allows gargoyles to seamlessly blend into the surroundings like a friggin' octopus changing its pigmentation. They can appear as solid carved stone and could even detect and spy upon any living or undead presence within their local vicinity by watching them through the stone. Higher stages of Viscerotica allow gargoyles to seamlessly pass through stone, and even higher levels allow them to take on stone forms strong enough to withstand the sun itself, so long as they hold still. Another discipline unique to certain gargoyles is that of flight itself, with early stages of flight allowing the gargoyle to simply glide great distances. As they develop flight, they begin to learn how to perform running takeoffs and to actually flap their stone wings. At higher levels, gargoyles can launch vertically into the sky just from a standstill. So this, coupled with some enchantments brought upon them by their Tremere, ritual masters, means that at their height, the gargoyles were some scary son of a bitches, to say the least. The gargoyles, however, would eventually become liberated from the Tremere thanks to the actions of Gangrel and Shemitzi and some others who would actually work alongside one another, if only temporarily, to free their lost consanguineous siblings. Those gargoyles who survived long enough would eventually lose their bonds to the Tremere, thus regaining what little remained of their former identities. Gargoyles, while loyal, never quite lose the isolated existence that permeates within their Gangrel quote-unquote genes, meaning, as of tonight, they're perfectly fine with sitting alone, perched high above the world, free to contemplate their accursed existence. Chapter 6: The Golden Fangs, Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368 AD. Speaking of war crimes, let's advance our timeline to much later in history, during the times in which the Golden Mongol Horde was sweeping across Eurasia from the 13th to 14th century. Indeed, many kindred rode alongside the Mongols if only to capitalize on the chaos and discord. Though there are two historical major standouts to this: Arnulf and the Anda. The last we heard of Arnulf was roughly 800 years ago, when he first met Marcus Sextus prior to the end of Rome. Some claim that Arnulf helped the Turks sack Constantinople itself, and that he directly helped the Mongol horde lay waste to Poland and Hungary. None truly knew why Arnulf partook in so many of these wars and conquests of man, though most simply think that he was simply more of a force of nature than a vampire. It was as if Arnulf fully embraced the anarchic barbarity and savagery of man. He sired many vampiric children, all of which he let live wild and free to roam and shape the world as they saw fit. Let it be known that those very lands Arnulf would help conquer would inevitably become the very same lands that he would invade at a future point in time. Arnulf truly wanted to demolish civilization and to return to man's primeval roots. To him, there was no sinner worse than the man who fattened himself off the riches of civilization. Fittingly enough, this legendary barbarian would ultimately meet his final death at the hands of Vlad Tepes in single combat, when he mistakenly chose to side with the Turks of the Ottoman Empire during their conquest of the Carpathian Mountains. Another major standout of Gangrel Mongolian history was the aforementioned Anda. In the real world, having an Anda is like having a sacred, honorable bond held between men that effectively means blood brother, and it of course originates from Mongolia. Having an Anda bond would essentially mean that you would ride and die for whoever you have the bond with as if they were your own brother from the same womb. In VTM terms, the Anda were a strange and unique offshoot of Clan Gangrel that were purely composed of pure-blooded Mongolians. More scholarly vampires believe that one of Anoya's children, a Gangrel Methuselah remembered as Dobrul the Brave, served as the founder of the Anda. To know Dobrul's story, we have to look back to the era of the Shi dynasty, the earliest known dynasty in Chinese history, some 1 to 2,000 plus years or so before Christ. Legends claim that in life, Dobrul was a Mongolian son and protector of Mother Utugan. Mother Utugan could simply be seen as a sort of eternally pure Mother Earth figure within the shamanistic religions of the Eurasian steppes. So to be a protector of Mother Utugan, like Dobrul, is to protect the very land and earth itself. In time, the lands of Mother Utugan, which we now call Mongolia, would be invaded by the Cathayans. ancient Chinese vampires from the Shu dynasty remembered by many names, from Kui Jin to Wang Kui. These demon-banded Cathayans tore through the land for days on end, driving away all of Mother Atugan's children. In the end, it was only Dabrul who bravely stood to face the foreign menace. During Dabrul's final stand, a Shu shaman ushered a curse, and a great ball of fire was summoned from the sky and cast down upon Atugan's final protector. The blast did not kill Dabrul, but instead drove him deep within the earth. The demon shaman's curse, alongside Mother Atugan's loving embrace, transformed Dabrul into a powerful and ancient Gangrel Methuselah. It is believed Dabrul remains deep within the earth still, though at that point he used his power to form the Anda, scions of Dabrul and protectors of Mother Atugan, with an eternal grudge against the Shu and their Cathayan demons. This brings us back to the Mongol Empire, 1300 or so years after Christ's death. The Anda dominated the night during the times of the Mongols and their conquest across Eurasia. Even Dabrul's own grandson, Jolma the Damned, served as general and close companion to Genghis Khan himself, in both life and undeath. Funny enough, the figure of Jolma is actually believed to have been one of Genghis Khan's real-life closest friends in, our world history as well. During a fight between the Mongols and Chinese, however, a horde of Wan Kui Cathayans ultimately defeated and paralyzed the Gangrel Anda Jolma the Damned. The Cathayans used his body and cast a strange generational blood curse upon the Anda bloodline that called forth all of the descendants of Dabrul in order for their immediate slaughter. By the 14th century, all Anda were believed to have been wiped out due to this generational curse. To conclude our discussion of the Mongolian chapter of Gangrel history, I'll read a small portion from Fanbook Gangrel Revised Edition. These fierce warriors rode with the barbarians among the nomads of the Central Asian steppe, and followed the hordes led by the Mongol Khans. The Anda, blood brother in Mongolian, were supremely adapted to survival on the high plains, both in life and unlife. They had no fear of travel and put more land beneath their mounts' feet than many vampires have seen in centuries of existence. They practiced the gangrel disciplines of fortitude and protean, though their own unique variations of animalism specifically suited them to the needs of the nomad. Unfortunately for the Anda, the Asian knights do not belong to kindred alone. The mysterious vampires of China rose up collectively against the Anda at the close of the Yuan dynasty, exacting retribution for every city sacked and village burned by exterminating the bloodline to a man. Any Anda left in the world would have been in torpor for 7 centuries or more and simply shows no signs of returning. Any intelligent Cainite knows that the Anda are truly no more. Okay, that's enough about the Mongolians. Let's advance our timeline to the events leading up to one of the most horrific eras in history for not just vampires, but all mortals and supernaturals. What some call the Burning Times, and what most call the Knights of the Inquisition. Chapter 7, The Burning Times, roughly 1399 to 1599 AD. You see, vampires have openly ruled and swaggered about as undead immortal lords of the night since before the fall of Rome. Even the Gangrel started to get comfortable terrorizing villages and castles, running off with cattle, children, virgins, etc. By the time the Mongols had begun to lose their legendary rule at the end of the 1300s, mortals en masse had started to wake up and realize that vampires were not indestructible or omniscient. In the late 14th to early 15th century, the Roman Catholic Church had fully begun to wage their holy wars against heretics, Satanists, witches, lupines, Cainites, anything it could get its hands on. These burning times of the Inquisition lasted for hundreds of years and resulted in the decimation of several vampires. And while the Gangrel tended to avoid civilization, features of their bestial nature like clawed paws or spider eyes made them stand out like the Nosferatu. Couple that with their skittish and animalistic nature alongside some well-placed traps and, well, you have yourself 1,000 or more Gangrel just waiting to meet their final deaths upon the pyre. It was well known and documented that the Inquisition resulted in the total annihilation of several vampiric bloodlines. For the Gangrel, the once proud bloodline known as the Lianen would be the ones driven to extinction at the hands of the Inquisition. The Lianen were a unique bloodline to the regions of the Celts, Gauls, and Slavs, primarily composed of your typical Instagram druid, which plays with herbs, believes in astrology, reads tarot cards, and has way too many bad tattoos. While that's normal by today's standards, you know for damn sure that the Lianen were pretty damn high up on the Holy Inquisitor's totem pole of targets deserving immediate persecution. And while it's not 100% guaranteed that the Lianen were a bloodline like the Anda, they had all the keynote features of the Gangrel, though with the addition of a more fey and druidic twist. In truth, nobody knows the true origin story of the Lianen, or if they're truly Gangrel at all. But their origin story goes something like this. Chapter 8. The Children of the Crone, Lianen, Prehistoric Times. Long ago, mythical long ago, a shadowy and esoteric female figure used her witch powers to supplant an earthly woodland spirit directly into the body of a vampire. This esoteric female figure was none other than the Crone. Yeah, that Crone. One of the more peculiar figures within Nodus history. If you're not sure who she is, definitely give my Cain and Lilith video a watch then. We won't go over the Crone's backstory again, but I suspect the creation of the Lianen occurred while Cain was blood bonded to her. Specifically after the Crone forces Cain to bring her several of his offspring, the ones in which we never heard from again. Anyway, according to legend, the Crone takes a woodland spirit and forces it to possess some nameless vampire, which I've decided to unofficially name the Leshy. Simply put, a Leshy is a creature from, I believe, Slavic folklore, which can be seen as a sort of territorial guardian spirit within various domains of nature. So a very fitting name, as you'll come to find out. The Leshy was equally territorial as the creature it borrows its namesake from, though with the addition of a vicious vampiric bloodthirst. Those who entered the Leshy's domain were forced to give sacrifices of the blood to both the Leshy and all other vampires inevitably embraced by it. Each time the Leshy performed the embrace, a piece of the woodland spirit within it would break away from the Leshy and remain within the newly embraced Lianen, thus granting it the territorial aggression possessed by the original, though the effect would diminish with each embrace performed. Whenever a Lianen was destroyed, that piece of the spirit would disappear forever. This brings us back to the burning times. By the time of the Inquisition, there were less than 20 Lianen in existence. During their time in history, the Lianen would remain among the Slavic, Gallic, and Celtic woodlands familiar to the Leshy's domain, only fleeing during times of emergency. As mentioned a few times now, they were fiercely territorial and regularly avoided civilization at all costs. As a matter of fact, most Lianen grew physically ill while within the walls of civilization. Thanks to their affinity and connection to the woodland spirits of nature, the Lianen possessed a unique discipline known as Augum, which replaced the usual discipline of fortitude. Augum is a limited form of blood magic that isn't nearly as powerful as other forms of blood magic utilized by other vampiric clans, like the Tremere. However, the power and feel of Augum blood magic is drawn from the woodland spirit that possesses all Lianen, giving their magic a unique druidic twist. These blood rituals allow the Lianen to awaken the plant life within their domain to grant them protection, as well as gaining several boons or bestowing curses upon others using pagan blood symbols drawn upon their skin. One of the more advanced rituals, known as the Woad of Tyrannus, actually appears much further down in this iceberg due to how just powerful and interesting I find it. And we won't wait to talk about it, we'll talk about it now. The ritual itself takes 3 nights to prepare and requires a mortal victim. During the 3 nights, the Lianen constructs a roughly 28-foot or 8-meter tall wicker man. Then the Lianen that will receive the boon of the ritual steps forth and spills their blood all over the damn effigy, like all over it. The mortal victim is tied to the wicker man and the entire site is burned to ashes, roughly over the course of 3 hours. The ashes are mixed with woad, a special type of yellow flower typically used in the creation of dye, and then mixed and painted upon the chest of the ritual beneficiary. The symbol of Tyrannus, which is depicted as an 8-spoked wheel, is painted upon the beneficiary's chest, a roll is made, and if the roll passes, the symbol burns itself into the flesh of the beneficiary and causes a point of aggravated damage. Simply put, aggravated damage is a type of damage that can't be absorbed or simply shrugged off by a vampire, whereas superficial damage, like a punch or cut, can be soaked and ignored. Once the symbol is activated, the vampire becomes immune to Rotschreck, and all damage caused by fire and sunlight is treated as if it was superficial damage. meaning it has the possibility of being absorbed and ignored by the beneficiary. So, simply put, so long as the vampire possesses the scar of the Woad of Tyrannus and doesn't heal the aggravated point of damage that it caused, they're almost entirely invulnerable to the vampire's curse of the sun. I cannot stress how absolutely crazy that is. The Lianen are one of the extremely few vampires in the entirety of VTM lore able to withstand the sun like this. Unfortunately for the Lianen, it seems that the Woad of Tyrannus was not able to protect them from the hands of Roman intervention, and now they are all gone. Chapter 9. The Wolves of the Sea. Ahrimanes. Ahrimans? It doesn't matter. Prehistoric times. Another strange Gangrel bloodline that stands out within the time of the Dark Ages is that of the Ahrimanes. The Ahrimanes were a rare, all-female bloodline of Norse Gangrel that weren't originally part of the clan, but were subsumed into it. In order to understand the origins of the Ahrimanes, we first have to discuss the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie, or Valkyries, I'm just going to call them Valkyries, but I'm pretty sure the actual pronunciation is a little different. The Valkyries are an all-group of all-female vampire warriors from the Norselands who serve the interest of their leader, Odin the All-High. Odin is a legendary Germanic Gangrel Methuselah who served as a high priest of the Norse gods, and is basically one of the reasons that Vikings exist, like at all. And the last we heard of the All-High, he woke up from his ancient sleep at some point in the late 70s so he could casually hunt and destroy packs of werewolves in order to drink their blood. We'll have to unpack Odin's story another time, but for now, let's circle back to the origins of the Ahrimanes, starting with a specific Valkyr named Adisa. Legends claim that Adisa was a daughter of the Norse goddess Freyja and a Valkyrie. She traveled far and wide in the name of the All-High, before eventually drawing the attention of a Persian king named Ahriman. The king commanded Adisa to fight for him in his army, but Adisa refused to do so. Furious, Ahriman sent his men to subdue Adisa, and while she was exceedingly powerful, not even the Valkyrie could stand against such overwhelming forces. Unwilling to submit under any circumstances, Adisa remained standing until a warrior slew her on the third day of their fight. When Freyja came to take her daughter to the afterlife of Folkvangir, Adisa refused. She did not begrudge the warriors who slain her, since she had been fairly bested, but she loathed Ahriman for his presumption and waging war against the single woman. Seeing her daughter's distress, Freyja agreed to hide Adisa from the other Norse gods for 3 nights, though not days, so that she might seek her revenge. The Persian king Ahriman and his court fled from the wrath of Adisa in great carriages and ships. However, Freyja had taught her daughter to speak with the animals of the earth when she was young. They were able to tell Adisa where Ahriman had fled. The second night, even more fearful of Adisa, King Ahriman slew all the animals in his kingdom so that they could not reveal his location. Unfortunately for Ahriman, Adisa knew how to talk to the spirits of the animals as well. Ain't that some shit? On the third night, Adisa arrives at King Ahriman's castle, where the king had barricaded all the doors and windows. Adisa tears the castle apart with her bare hands until she finds Ahriman himself. As she kills him, she took his name from him as a punishment, thus cursing Ahriman to wander forever lost in the afterlife. As Freyja returned to take Adisa with her, the Valkyr still refused. Adisa's own vengeance was done, but her exposure to the Persian Empire made Adisa demand judgment for all those women who had been wronged like her. Fair enough, right? I mean, have you read what happens when a Persian prince's 43rd wife steps out of line? I mean, Jesus. Adisa would begin to roam the land, gathering and liberating women under the name Ahrimans, or Ahrimans. Adisa would walk the night as their leader. This brings us to some period during the Long Night, or the Dark Ages, roughly 400 to 1200 AD. Adisa's lineage and the Ahrimans would predominantly spread along the coasts of Scandinavia, Scotland, Ireland, and to a lesser extent, England and Normandy. The typical Ahriman usually shares Adisa's willful independence, and while she acknowledges Freyja as her divine mother, she bows to neither god nor king. Then, at some point during the Dark Ages, the entirety of the Ahrimans straight up vanished from existence, and nobody really knows why. Some speculate that Adisa took the Ahrimans on some sort of grand Nordic pilgrimage, while others think that they were all simply wiped out prior to the times of Inquisition. Much like the Anda or the Lianen, the Ahrimans are all gone. So we thought. You see, at some point during the Sabbat's expansion into the Americas, like roughly 1500 to roughly 1800 AD or so, hell, maybe even up to now, something weird happened. Once, a Sabbat-aligned Gangrel anti-tribu named Mauricia performed a powerful ritual that set herself apart from her clan, forever destroying her ability to perform the embrace or to even establish a blood bond. However, the ritual also imbued Mauricia with an innate connection to the spirit world. This new type of vampire isn't a bloodline in the usual sense of the word, as they do not pass their blood from sire to child via the embrace. Mauricia would adopt a new name for this unique sort of bloodline ritual thing: Ahrimane. Every Ahrimane ritually created since Mauricia was created specifically from a female gangrel, though few know whether this is simply preference or something mandated by the ritual itself. Cainite historians have a couple of theories on the ritual. The first is that only Mauricia herself can enact the ritual that it creates an Ahrimane. I'm sorry, I know I keep butchering the terms. I'm but a humble Texan, so bear with me. The first theory is that only Mauricia herself can enact the ritual that creates an Ahrimane, and she refuses to perform it for men. The second theory states is that they have in fact tried to create multiple male counterparts, and none survived the transformation. The final theory assumes that after Mauricia performs her ritual, she came in contact with Adisa and was more or less possessed or compelled by her. However, honestly, none of this really matters because, like the original Ahrimans from the Long Night, these modern-day Ahrimans disappeared in early 1998 or so. Or at least, that's when the Sabbat first noticed that they were all missing, as they were never the most social creatures. Once again, nobody truly knows where or why they've gone. Whatever the truth is, their havens lie empty and inquiries go unanswered. The Ahrimanes weren't the only Sabbat-aligned gangrel bloodline that once existed during the expansion into the New World. One of the bloodlines that hasn't been driven to extinction is that of the city and country gangrel, which brings us to Chapter 10, Hunter, Mariner, Coyote, the New World, roughly 1400 to roughly 1899 AD. The idea of the city gangrel originated as far back as Greece during the Dark Ages, and are essentially gangrel that have adapted to urban environments. They've maintained existence within urban environments for so long they've actually developed celerity and obfuscate in exchange for fortitude and animalism. In modern nights, they form about half of the gangrel anti-tribu within the Sabbat. Nowadays, they're commonly referred to as coyotes, and they regularly transition from wilderness to urban environments, primarily when hunting. Given that they're Sabbat-aligned, coyotes are regularly embraced into existence, given their creation and acceptance rights, and then unleashed into the world, though their life expectancy is pretty damn short. City gangrel, unlike their country counterparts, regularly maintain a human facade in order to blend in with their urban environment, which usually takes on the form of some vagrant homeless guy. Despite maintaining a mortal appearance, they are still Sabbat, meaning they regularly give into their bestial nature. So if the city gangrel populates the slums and the streets, then you can probably guess what a country gangrel is. Referred to as the hunters, country gangrel are much more animalistic wild ones that prowl long stretches of highway or rural open farmlands far away from cityscapes. Country gangrel possess the same disciplines as your standard gangrel. What sets them apart is their affinity to the Sabbat, and therefore to total animalistic primality. For a country gangrel, the trick is to avoid being human, not to blend in with them. They're primarily used as scouts and hunters, and their only regret is that they killed their prey too fast when performing a hunt. As I mentioned long ago, if you ever thought you spotted a Bigfoot or chupacabra, it was more than likely a country gangrel. The final and perhaps most mysterious gangrel bloodline that currently exists is that of the Gangrel Mariners. Members of Clan Tremere refer to the Mariners as Gangrel Aquari. Regardless of what we call them, the Mariners are gangrel who have taken on the forms of sea creatures that have almost entirely forgone mortal and kindred existence to be among the lightless depths of the ocean. The Mariners are problematic as a bloodline in that their culture and history is pretty much entirely unknown, and the Camarilla or Sabbat have absolutely zero means of enforcing their ideologies or traditions upon them. Gangrel Mariners possess the disciplines standard among the gangrel, though they use their disciplines to grant themselves webbed claws, fins, and other strange appendages that allow them to rule from the deep. To be a mortal chosen to enter the fold of the Mariners most likely involves being embraced, then left to drown in the oceanic or lakeside domains belonging to the Mariner. Luckily, vampires don't need to breathe, but that doesn't mean the terror caused by water filling your lungs doesn't immediately go away. If you're lucky, then the mariner that embraced you was at least kind enough to leave some bloody fish or meat nearby for you to stabilize your undead state. After that, well, get comfortable drowning. At worst, if you're not into it, you can always return to land and continue your existence in undeath, away from whatever strange eldritch machinations go on underneath our oceans. Anyway, let's advance our timeline to the 1960s so we can talk about the Kennedy assassination. Chapter 11, Zeke, the contemporary era, 1960s and beyond. Yeah, so Clan Book Gangrel Revised Edition, the book I'm primarily using when making this video, is, as you recall, a series of analyses done by several kindred over email, interviews, online forums, etc. One of the members of these forums, a mostly unhinged gangrel named Zeke, had some pretty crazy claims regarding certain events within history. One of those involving Kennedy. I'm just gonna read from the book directly.
Lutsenko. Yeah, I remember the first time I heard that name. One of the many that would go on to define American history from behind closed doors. And a name you'd be wise to keep to yourself. I was sworn by blood never to say the man's name out loud. But you want the truth? Fine, I'll give it to you. See, the last time I checked, over 50 books still in print claimed to uncover the truth behind John F. Kennedy's death. But not one of them has it right. If you look at a couple of the more reputable books and mix in with what we know as kindred, you get a pretty clear picture of what's going on. I can sum it up in 2 words. Kennedy knew. The Camarilla, not the Bavarian Illuminati, not the Priory of Sion, is the oldest conspiracy in the world. Like those other conspiracies, its masters are willing to kill anyone to keep this secret. Now, how JFK came to learn of the truth is anyone's guess. Perhaps by virtue of his family's fortune and his association with mobsters like Giancana and high rollers like Sinatra, maybe Jack had lured around the fringes of a fucking power structure long enough to get an inkling of the truth. His girlfriend Marilyn may have spent time as a blood doll to a stupid Toreador anarch in LA, or she might have just rubbed elbows with Giancana's other dead friends. Not clear in the details, but it don't really matter. Jack knew, and the wrong people suspected that he was going to go public with the knowledge of the undead after the '64 election. Now, it was the Camarillas in their council that ordered the hit, and it was the then current Gangrel Justica who spearheaded the efforts. None other than Lutsenko. He coordinated the activity of our tools in the Mafia. Lutsenko used his usual puppetry on a couple of mortal surrogates, David Ferry and Eladio de Valle, to get New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello to organize the hit. Marcello didn't have to lean hard on his boy Lee Harvey to persuade him to do the deed. It was a pain in the ass to clean up, let me fucking tell you. I was Lutsenko's archon throughout the shit show of the 60s and early 70s. Lutsenko had me put down Eladio de Valle in Miami myself, and to make sure that no kindred would get him, he insisted that I mangle the corpse pretty seriously. At the time, others nailed David Ferry in New Orleans. Marcello, Giancana, and all those loose-end bastards were retired by myself at the behest of Lutsenko. And when all was said and done, and the Johnson administration had made its own messes, we had to coordinate half the Nixon administration and clean up the rest of the paper trail back to us. Still, mortals are clever and have found enough holes to elude the conspiracy and foul play. Luckily for the Camarilla, the CIA regularly takes the blame for this terror. In other words, Lutsenko and the rest of those murderers are sitting comfortably, shaping the world as they see fit, and their involvement with JFK has remained hidden until now.
So there you go. Kennedy found out about the Camarilla, and you know the rest. Anyway, let's move on to another one of Zeke's wild-ass claims. Once again, I read from the book.
Shortly after Zeke's post about JFK and the Inner Council's involvement, he began flooding the discussion forum with all manner of quote-unquote secret truths regarding the Ferals. Most of us shrugged it off. It was only after he disappeared from the night entirely did we begin to look into what he had to say. I'm not going to repeat most of it, because we have plenty of reasons to think that his claims are truthful. Or, at least, someone greater than us must be hiding something. Because other forum members looking into Zeke's claims have also begun to vanish. I'm choosing to leave the JFK claim here because, unfortunately, it seems to be one of the lighter claims made by that crazy Gangrel bastard. On a lighter note, another claim made by Zeke also involves Luchenko, and a specific event that occurred in 1968 along the Ohio River Valley in West Virginia. Luchenko and his archons, Zeke included, were tasked with investigating a series of strange sightings of a large, winged humanoid creature with equally large red eyes. The Mothman, as you may call him. Upon investigation, it became clear that the Mothman was a heavily disfigured gangrel who succumbed to our bloodbane. Zeke and the rest of his archons butchered the poor feral without remorse. They didn't have to pull many strings in order for the press to completely forgo the idea of vampiric involvement, though the Mothman was definitely the cause of the cattle mutilations running rampant at this time. All of it is still thankfully blamed on UFOs to this very night.
So there you go, Mothman and JFK. Well, look no further than the Gangrel. If that isn't deepest lore, then I don't know what is. Chapter 12, Claiming Independence, 1999 AD. Or, it's 1999. A majority of the Gangrel have left the Camarilla behind to remain as an independent clan, if we can call them a clan. This truly became official in 1999 when the Gangrel Justicar of the Camarilla went before the Inner Council, declared independence for the Ferals, and walked out of the Camarilla entirely. As for the Sabbat, the Gangrel Anti-Tribu have walked among their ranks since the cult's inception, though this has begun to change. More and more members of the Gangrel Anti-Tribu have taken notice of the devotion to freedom taken by their Camarilla counterparts, and have also begun to abandon the way of Cain. Those Gangrel who withdrew from the Camarilla and Sabbat, but did not wish to remain independent, have found a place among the many anarch free states that litter the world. Chapter 13, How Gangrel View the Others. As of tonight, the nomads, ferals, vagabonds, wolves, and coyotes, and all the other types of Gangrel, simply continue to wander, their strange and ascetic existence left purely at the will of the animalistic beast that drives them. Their opinions and interactions with the other clans vary wildly, though their outlook on the many clans goes something like this. The Gangrel and the Banu Hakim have clashed on the battlefields of Europe and Asia for centuries. They have also fought side by side, perhaps even during the same battles, as both clans were known for their mercenary tendencies. Both clans have learned to respect each other for their martial prowess and brutal honesty. Nowadays, however, the Gangrel have gained plenty of reasons to fear the Banu Hakim, now that the Banu Hakim's curse placed upon them has been lifted. To put it simply, a long time ago the Tremere put a blood curse on the Banu Hakim in order to stop them from religiously killing and eating other vampires, and now that curse has been lifted. It's a whole thing, we'll break it down when we talk about the Banu Hakim themselves or the Tremere in a future video. But regardless, for the Gangrel, killing is a matter of survival and not a religion. Luckily, the Banu Hakim recognize that taking down a lone Gangrel to satiate Allah is no easy feat. The Bruja and the Gangrel relate well on a superficial level. Both can agree that violence is just as fun as rebelling against authority. However, relationships that dig deeper tend to devolve into feuds. Simply put, the Gangrel and Bruja are better when unified under a single cause, otherwise you're bound to have a riot. The vampires of the Ministry and the Gangrel have few positives and negatives that they can say about one another, due to a general lack of interaction. Tensions run high in those areas where contact is common, such as, Northern Africa and extensive city parks along the US coasts. These tensions typically give way to bloodshed or treachery on those occasions that one side or the other is accused of doing something unsightly. The necromancers of the Hecata have practically nothing in common with the Gangrel. They don't even have anything meaty to argue about. As remarkable as this fact is among vampires, it does not make them allies. Their worlds simply rarely meet. Respect is the key in maintaining relationships between the Gangrel and the La Sombra. The Gangrel respect the La Sombra for their capable leadership and their appearance of honesty. The La Sombra respect the Gangrel's strength of character and ferocity. God, there you go with the inflections of the R again. The Gangrel don't trust the La Sombra, of course, and the La Sombra still attempt to make the Gangrel into political pawns. But at least the Gangrel know that the Keepers of the Shadows will think long and hard before attempting to screw them over. As for the Malkavians, well, the Gangrel fear the Malkavians. Any rational, survival-oriented vampire does. The Malkavians are insightful, unpredictable, and more or less wholly insane. The Gangrel take great pains to regularly weed out instability from their broods, at least in the young. The beast inevitably claims the minds of the old. The Malkavians, for their part, seem to sense the Gangrel's uneasiness, and like a cat that knows who it can annoy the most, the Malkavians have some strange joy in finding and annoying the Gangrel whenever possible. Kindred of the Nosferatu and Gangrel have established an understanding between them, a very sad and resigned sort of arrangement. Neither clan can truly understand what the other experiences. For the Gangrel, the slow dissolution of personality, and for the Nosferatu, the sudden obliteration of self-image. But it is empathy, not sympathy, that defines the relationship between the Gangrel and the Nosferatu. And that's something rare for both groups. Gangrel and Nosferatu do not screw each other over lightly. Most will not do it at all if it can be avoided. Indeed, the Nosferatu may be the greatest ally the Gangrel may ever have, should they ever need one. As you know, the Gangrel and the Ravnos share a rather turbulent relationship that is centuries old, if not more so. Not every Gangrel attacks a Ravnos on sight, or vice versa. As a matter of fact, nothing is keeping either clan from being acquaintances, members of a coterie, or even just being mutually civil. Regardless, the millennia-long feud between the two continues up to this very night. Rebellious types will always embrace quote-unquote the enemy just because someone told them not to. Among the Anarchs, Gangrel often feign a devil-may-care attitude toward the Ravnos, while keeping a close eye on their gear and tactics. Sabbat vampires seem to take perverse pleasure in creating Ravnos and Gangrel alliances, but these undertakings usually turn out like so many other Sabbat fairs, short-lived, bloody, and full of death. At the extreme, some ill-fated pairings insist that the continuing feud between the Gangrel and Ravnos is the will of the antediluvians acted out through the centuries, part of the jihad itself. Like Shakespeare, some Gangrel and Ravnos rebel against their family's wishes. But we all know how Romeo and Juliet ends. It would be difficult to think of two vampire clans with less in common than the Toreador and the Gangrel. The Toreador consider the Gangrel to be crude, uncouth, dirty, repugnant, and lacking culture. The Gangrel, in return, consider the Toreador to be stuck-up, elitist, domesticated, and prone to overdone contemplation. Both sides are usually right, and with these differences out in the open and acknowledged, very little open conflict ever occurs between the Toreador and the Gangrel. They simply move in different circles and are content that way. Rare instances of intense inter-clan cooperation usually center on particularly pleasant pieces of land. These partnerships are fleeting, as the Toreador usually loses interest in ecological matters once the patch of ground has been preserved as money in the bank or assets on the social registry. An old rivalry festers between the Tremere and the Gangrel. The clans have been at each other's pale throats since the Dark Ages, when the warlocks encroached into the lands of Eastern Europe. And you remember the gargoyles. Gangrel go missing all the time, and some of them, it is rumored, still wind up in Tremere laboratories. Despite its many flaws, the Camarilla at least attempted to outline a truce among all the clans. And now that that no longer applies to the Gangrel who have left the Camarilla, many of them are itching to rake their claws through the Tremere as revenge against them. The Tremere, for their part, would like to see the Gangrel put down for good, perhaps to punish the affront to the Camarilla, and most certainly to put a dangerous enemy out of the way. Despite their shared talents for shape-changing, the Gangrel and Shemitzi have little in common. Gangrel preferred to use words like warp and mutate to refer to what the Shemitzi calls art. Elder Gangrel and Shemitzi of a certain age share a vague resentment born of the conflict with the hated Tremere. Sires and their childer who remember those times in memory, or in story, might at least act politely when engaging with either clan, if only at first. The Ventru once saw the Gangrel as useful. Sold on the metaphor, they thought of the Gangrel as hunting dogs, bloodhounds, and the occasional retriever. But now the hound has turned to bite the hand that ordered it around. And, well, the Gangrel's attitude towards the Ventru is forever unchanged. To the Gangrel, the Ventru were uptight, self-important bastards who could never understand that, all along, the Gangrel were only simply choosing to accept to follow orders. Chapter 14. Gangrel Around the World. So with everything that we've learned about the Gangrel, where does this leave us as of tonight? Well, if you ask me, we're simply in a transitory point of Gangrel history, simply awaiting the ferals to make their next mark. There are less than 500 Gangrel that remain throughout the world at large, though some believe the number is less than half of that. Much like the fabled Anoia, it's only a matter of time before we see the Gangrel do some explosive shit. Until then, we can only watch and appreciate them from afar, just as they watch us. Let's discuss some of what we know regarding gangrel presence all around the world as of today. Or tonight, rather. The vampires of Africa are a rare species indeed. The vast majority of the continent is populated by lupines and other strange shape-shifting beasts vaguely resembling vampires that will have to break down the kindred of the Ebony Kingdom at a different time. The gangrel may be one of, if not the, dominant vampiric presence within Africa. As a matter of fact, most gangrel claim their presence in Africa has persisted since the destruction of the Second City, way back in Enochian times. And others claim that Enoya herself actually remains somewhere in Africa as of tonight. A vast majority of the gangrel present in Africa have forgone their humanity to roam freely among the vast wildlands of the continent, while others have devoted themselves to uncovering ancient vampiric history among the dunes of Egypt. One notable group of gangrel, known as the Nyayo, maintains sway within Kenyan politics. They primarily use this influence to keep Kenya as far from European and American influences as possible, though they especially fight to keep the Camarilla and Sabat away at all costs. There also exists a pack of communist sympathizers in Sudan simply calling themselves the Red Menace, who regularly fight to provide financial and technical backing to communist revolutionaries across all of Africa. The past several decades have been difficult for the gangrel of Asia. Western kindred have not freely roamed the lands of China since the existence of the Mongolians and the Anda. For centuries, Asian gangrel had wandered through Mongolia and further north, until a twisted and strange magic settled over Russia at some point in the early 90s that trapped those inside and kept others out. This event was remembered as the Shadow Curtain, and will be broken down in more detail when we discuss Clan Nosferatu. Recently, the Shadow Curtain has finally fallen, or I guess, has finally been lifted rather. And those gangrel trapped inside had got the hell out of there and fled west, south, or even north over the pole to escape the influence of the Shadow Curtain and the strange, vile hag who enacted it. The gangrel of India are caught in a losing battle with the expansion of mortals that continue to leave the cities and cross into the countryside. As the wilds continue to disappear, Indian gangrel are regularly forced to increase conflict with the Ravnos, only feeding the flames of enmity on both sides, and with the neighboring Chinese. The gangrel do not have a recorded presence in Japanese or Indonesia, though the occasional traveler may share their tales of their visits to those lands. Reports tell of a group of 3 gangrel running smuggling operations across the northern border of China into Russia, moving large quantities of Chinese manufactured goods and risking the wrath of Beijing's Cathayan undead. The motivations of these gangrel, who remain nameless and faceless, are completely unknown, but one must imagine that the reasons do not involve money. Another unusual coalition of gangrel once claimed to have recovered a lost nuclear warhead from an archipelago north of Russia. They're probably lying though, let's not think about that too much. Australia and New Zealand are the closest thing on Earth to a gangrel paradise. The vast majority of the wilderness is mostly unsettled, the people are tough and resourceful, and lupines are almost nowhere to be seen. The cities house a healthy presence of kindred from all clans and invading Sabat, but nobody wants the bush quite like the gangrel. Many gangrel who visit Australia and New Zealand never leave, and more than one native insurgent has suggested establishing one or the other island as a gangrel free state. In New Zealand, the Sabat succeeded in establishing a presence, regularly drawing members from the young Polynesian minorities who felt cheated by their government. One well-known and venerable Maori gangrel, Nairi Waka, has hit the warpath against the Sabat incursion in New Zealand. She has no real quarrel with Sabat ideology, but the young vampires, many of them city gangrel, have regularly begun to misappropriate the ritual Moko face tattoos into their pack style, defacing once honorable distinctions not properly earned. Try to not piss off this Maori gangrel grandma, she will delete you. Europe is not nearly as peaceful a place to be a gangrel. More wilderness disappears every year despite the efforts of humans, lupines, and the occasional vampire. Gangrel elders here may be over a millennium old. Once crowding occurs, the younger neonate and ancillate find themselves pushed into the cities, where they're looked down on by kindred society at large or kicked off the continent entirely. One notable gangrel is Brunhild, the leader of the Scandinavian Valkyries, like Adisa and the Ahrimanes. She and her kind have recently awakened a host of Valkyries that preside over the revival of Old Norse and Viking ways, which regularly involves raising hell among Europe's anarchs. Another Gangrel, Rufus of Andorra, has watched the Sabbat's destruction and degradation of Spain from atop his mountain peaks for centuries, and has therefore begun stockpiling weapons and embracing vampire broods in secure havens, en masse. Nobody is quite certain as to why a single Gangrel in Spain has begun to stockpile weapons and vampires, though Camarilla Archons have been dispatched to investigate. Gangrel hold a well-respected place in vampiric society within the Middle East. Perhaps vampires who struggle for survival in the harsh, arid climate have a greater understanding of the clan's steadfast strength. The mortal population of the area, caught between modernization and religious fervor, has made undeath difficult for vampires of any clan. The numbers of people with true faith have risen, and vampires fear the fiery bombs of extremists as keenly as any human. Still, in the rural and wilderness areas favored by the Gangrel, life and death go on as they have for years. The Gangrel of North America have taken the majority of the abuse in the wake of the clan's separation from the Camarilla. All along the east coast, where tensions between the Sabbat and the Camarilla are commonplace, Gangrel are treated with suspicion at best or destroyed on sight at worst. The many princes of the Camarilla figure that those Gangrel who are not outright traitors are deserters. Loyal Camarilla Gangrel stay close to their havens and to their Camarilla domains in order to avoid misidentification. Along the west coast, the Gangrel also have the Cathaeans to worry about, who have begun to establish their influence along the coast. The hot, wet geography of South America is an extensive haven for the Gangrel. It also shelters shape-changing cats and terrifying lizard monsters, but most local Gangrel accept the test of their survival skills as a fair exchange. Even though the continent seems welcoming to the Gangrel, only the truly foolish head into the Amazon basin, where the lupines regularly fight some horrendous technological manifestation. Gangrel embraced from the indigenous tribes of the area claim that there is a strange bloodline of native vampires in the jungles who share many of the Gangrel's affinity with the bat, creatures who wreak devastation when awakened without proper propitiation and rituals. Those inclined to believe such tales keep an eye on the rainforest. One notable Gangrel is that of Zotli the Toad, a hideous creature with bulging eyes, oozing skin, and a long, sticky tongue. Zotli is infamous for making lone guerrilla strikes against any target, Sabbat or otherwise, whoever offers him a deal worth considering. Chapter 15. When Thrown to the Wolves. Mortals chosen to be embraced into the dwindling ranks of Clan Gangrel are few and far between. A Gangrel sire often finds worthy candidates during times of feeding. If their mortal prey fights against what is happening to them, then their reward after death may be the taste of Gangrel blood. The clan has regularly performed embraces this way since the days of Anoia and her wars against the Ravnos. This method naturally produces only those Gangrel with a fierce desire to survive. Other methods of choosing mortals for the embrace are found just by sheer observation alone. While most mortals remain safely hidden during the night, those very few that risk the darkness are intriguing to the ferals. When one of their clan spots a mortal like this, they tend to watch instead of attacking or even provoking. If the target demonstrates purpose and versatility among the dark, they become worthy of consideration. Most are just lost or clearly incapable, to which they're simply deemed prey. There are some exceptions though. Some Gangrel have been known to embrace completely incapable people purely as a means of spite. The overly spoiled rich kid of LA has been known to disappear after pissing off the wrong Gangrel appearing as a homeless person. The Gangrel embrace itself is far from romantic. The ferals tend to prolong the suffering caused by the aggressive draining of the mortal's blood, forcing them to quite literally fight into their very last breath. This experience tends to be so traumatic that a vast majority of the Gangrel regard their embrace as a fate truly worse than death. There is a silver lining to this trauma, however, in that they're instilled with perhaps the greatest survival sense imaginable. This means only the most worthy Gangrel survive these overwhelming odds stacked against them. Chapter 16. Return with a pack. After the embrace is performed, the sire disappears into the night, completely leaving the new Gangrel alone to face the struggles of survival. Most do not last beyond even the first night. The first hunger for blood is the strongest, the beast quickly rousing to the surface. The progeny can make any number of mistakes during this initial rage. If the lupines, Ravnos, and/or other mortals or vampires do not destroy this progeny, the first sunrise usually does the trick. If the sire has chosen well, however, the progeny will quickly adapt. The reward for that first night is one of Anoia's gifts of animalism, protean, or fortitude. Those Gangrel resilient and capable enough to survive the next few nights quickly develop the rest of their disciplines, tools which allow the Gangrel to survive. Over time, the progeny learns how to grow claws, to speak with animals, and to supernaturally bury themselves under the earth. The new Gangrel must survive at least one winter before they're considered worthy of teaching. The phrase, "how many winters," is often the first question a Gangrel asks upon the first meeting of another Gangrel. Younger Gangrel rarely understand the question, which quickly reveals themselves as neonates. Gangrel tradition dictates that any pup encountered this way becomes a responsibility of the Gangrel who found them, the only exception being those Gangrel belonging to the Sabbat. The older Gangrel must aid the young blood in their survival and teach them the ways of the clan, at least until his nature is revealed. Once accepted, the new Gangrel learns the stories and traditions of their clan, like that of Anoya and basically everything else we've talked about. The younger vampire will be formally recognized as a Gangrel once the elder believes they're ready. They will be taught how to spot the signs of gathers and great gathers. During a gather, the Gangrel present discuss ongoing developments, establish enemies and allies, settle feuds, share secrets, welcome new bloods, and do all other manner of things before parting ways, perhaps never to see each other for upwards of years at a time, if ever again. Chapter 17. The most infamous Gangrel. One of the most well-known and infamous vampires that exists all across Vampire the Masquerade is actually a Gangrel, and also a Nodist scholar named Beckett, who is especially known for his inadvertent role in the mass publication of the modern Book of Nod, which wound up being one of the greatest masquerade breaches in history. Lore-wise, my entire Cain and Lilith video wouldn't exist had the Book of Nod I used to make said video not been published to the world at large. Beckett's greatest contribution to VTM comes in the form of Beckett's Jihad Diary, which is probably the best lore source book in the entire series, really. I plan on breaking down Beckett and his many tributes to the lore of VTM in a future video, preferably after I get a hold of the physical copy of Beckett's Jihad Diary. But consider this a small introduction of him to you, had you not already heard his name before. Beckett appears in just about every version of Vampire the Masquerade, video games included. Hell, Matt Mercer even played as him during one of those VTM LARP things online. Chapter 18. The other most infamous Gangrel. There is another infamous Gangrel that still, unfortunately, walks among us, though their infamy exists for all the wrong reasons. See, if Beckett's infamy comes from basically being the main character of VTM, this Gangrel's infamy comes from the fact that he represents pretty much everything wrong with modern Vampire the Masquerade. I'm of course talking about the Anarch Gangrel named RUDI. If you haven't already met RUDI, allow me to introduce him to you. I read from the Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition sourcebook directly. Alright gamers, we're chilling in the lair right now and I have the latest edition of Vampire the Masquerade. This is my boy Nix, by the way. The fucking excellent music you've been hearing throughout the entire track has been done by him. He's only got like 15 subscribers at the time of recording. I'm gonna put his channel in the description. I'll never tell y'all to subscribe to me, but definitely subscribe to my boy here because he's extremely talented. So I had my guys kidnap and bring you here against your will.
You guys blindfolded me, put a bag over my head, and then took me in a van just to a random location. I don't know where I am right now.
I don't know where we are either. I brought you here because I wanted to read you RUDI.
Tell me that this guy was the scariest Gangrel of like V5, right?
Yeah, and he's really serious, and we shouldn't, like, he's really scary. So, you got some water with you? I asked because he's really serious, and I know, well, look, I'm gonna ask you that you throw back some of that water. Just get you a, this is the first time, I promise this is the first time in my life I've asked someone to drink a mouthful of water. Now, don't spit that out. And in my end, I'm not allowed to smile, alright? I'm not gonna smile. We're not gonna smile, no laughing, because this is extremely serious. Modern Vampire the Masquerade. I can't believe I was dumb enough to get a tattoo of this game, because this is where we are now. A new player on the Kindred scene, RUDI commands an impressive following as an Anarch representative for the oppressed and repressed minorities in... I think I lost. For the oppressed and repressed minorities in vampire society. It's not even funny, I don't know why I'm laughing. Though his concerns extend to kine, or humans, as well. His recent entry into kindred existence has shown him that the fight mortals must undertake for equality is just as pressing for immortals. It's not even funny. Rudy's nightly life hasn't changed much since the Embrace. He still makes his haven in Copenhagen. He still hangs with the same friends, and he still attends the same clubs. He has only expanded his concerns. In addition to advocating for fellow mortal minorities, he now champions Gangrel, kept out of havens and feeding grounds by sprawl, stands up for female kindred in cities run by traditionally misogynistic elders, and encourages the adoption of progressive norms over tradition wherever possible. Some might think Rudy's combination of practicing Islam and unabashed queerness as contradictory. If you challenge the bare Gangrel in this notion. I'm not even reading the audio. Please stop writing like this. That's all. Goodbye. Sub to Nix. Nix, you want to say anything before you go?
New shit coming soon.
Yeah, so here's the thing. If what I just read sounded perfectly normal to you, so be it. But if what I just read sounded like the most try-hard, pseudo-woke garbage you've ever heard, well, you ain't heard nothing yet. So, yeah, Rudy is, you know, your generic woke anarch who treats vampires as if the letter V should be added to the end of LGBTQ. I don't know how else to put it. The newest version of VTM is full of this garbage approach, where vampires are treated less like monsters and more like marginalized minorities and victims of the establishment. Don't believe me? Well, stick around, I'll elaborate even further on that. Rudy leads a quote-unquote army of anarch quote-unquote revolutionaries, simply called Rudy's Army. I was hoping Rudy's army would be composed of a bunch of badass biker types who break into banks and violently redistribute wealth, but, well, the book called VTM Anarchs completely shits on those hopes. This new book on the Anarchs has an entire section purely talking about Rudy's army, and, yeah, this is how it unironically reads. Yeah, so I tried reading Rudy's army, and it killed me. I died from cringe. I died of cringe. Frankly, it just wasn't that entertaining, so I just cut out this video. So, I wanted to take this quick moment to thank Nix and the artist that I've been working with, who's currently in between names right now. He's trying to find a new name for himself. So I can't properly, I mean, I'm going to credit both of y'all. You know, Nix, first of all, makes this absolutely incredible music. All the music that you've heard throughout this entire video has been done by Nix, and he's an absolutely great guy. So please check out his channel, listen to his tracks. I also thank so much, No Name. Your new name, I'm going to call you No Name because you're figuring out your name. I mean, like I said, your handles are here. The artist that I'm working with, his handles are here. Very mysterious. Dude, this lighting does not do good for my beard. All the art that you're seeing on screen right now was done by him, and it's so good. Like, I don't know how to put into words how thankful I am beyond just saying, like, thank you a billion times. Both these dudes, they're great to hang out with, they're great to talk to on the side, they're really fun to work with, and honestly, they're, like, part of why this video is as awesome as it is. If you're watching this and you have music that you think would fit the kind of vibe and atmosphere of the videos that I make, or if you have art that you would like to, you know, that you'd like me to use in my videos, hit me up on Discord or hit me up on Instagram. I would absolutely love to use, I want to bring the community together, you know what I mean? Also, don't look up Rudy's Army if you don't want to die of cringe. I should have probably made a script for this. Okay, bye. In conclusion, the animalistic vampires of Clan Gangrel, aside from wannabes like Rudy, are primal, direct, purposeful, and seemingly untamable. You can see the raw instinct that drives them simply by looking into their eyes, even during times of calm. The ferals continue to wander, just as they have since the very beginning, and just as they will until the very end. Speaking of the end,